What is up? It is your boy, Not Critical. Today I'm going to be playing this random fucked up game. It's supposed to be, if you look up the video for this game, the trailer, it's like, best game ever, best game since this time, and if Jesus made this game, he would think that it was better than even he could think, and I don't know. We're gonna see what the fuck. Director's commentary? Oh, fuck yeah. Yo Doc. Director, what? That's pretty cool. I drown myself? I don't want to live. You can. Fuck.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of The Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther Developers Commentary.
Hi, I'm Rob Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
Who's around me? Who's around me right now?
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind the game as it came together.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
I got the director's commentary on. Okay, we're taking the higher path.
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were, and I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it, and one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen to me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way, that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really, really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomised blocks of voiceover in the game and the kind of randomised prop details that Rob was talking about means that it gives it a really different feeling every time you go through. And that's kind of interesting for me, because I like the idea of going, well, not everyone has to have the same experience, and because it's interactive, you have the capacity to have very different experiences occupying the same space. So yeah, but balancing all that then
What
becomes
the-
an absolute nightmare.
I think it's nice though because everybody gets a personal experience. Like I love reading the forums and seeing how people
Yeah, shut
come.
up, guys.
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use samples in a different way that wasn't just using it to sound like a violin. I wanted to time stretch and manipulate samples to make something different and strange and quite unique. But then when we got the Indie Fund money, I had the amazing opportunity to re-record the music with live players. And that was so exciting for me actually, because that's where it comes to life. And I thought long and hard about whether to write new music, going from the mod to the commercial version, but actually I decided that my initial and original emotional response to the game was probably going to be the strongest response and reaction that I had. So I just literally, the music that I'd written for samples, I then wrote out for live instruments. But
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language and the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very
It's a big
dreamlike,
penis.
symbolic, poetic thing. And it always frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It was very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe. This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, it's one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out of the commercial version because they felt like they were a little bit explicit. And instead, there's a lot more hidden kind of codes and symbols in there. There's still some stuff which you can only actually see or experience if you are not playing the game, if you're looking at it from editor. We had in the original mods things like trees planted to mirror the shape of the M5, or there's a whole bunch of things that are there to represent star clusters and all kinds of things like that. And we'll probably talk a bit more about kind of like hidden details and the secrets in the game as we go through. But that was really interesting for us in terms of the design of it, of going, you've got your kind of, your conscious, explicit play experience, but games are always constantly manipulating your mood and your feelings and the decisions you're making. And so really trying to create a space that had all of these kind of subliminals in it was a really interesting thing that we wanted to do, both with the...
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter, there's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or you know the characters that surround it. So you'll find that around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
every single button zooms you in. That's all they do. Yeah. You can't run, you can't do anything. You can zoom in as you look.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is it's one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted desolate landscape. We had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in an Eastern European city, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape. And we want to limit the player, so an island seems like a natural choice. And it's really interesting how you start from that, and we had this big lump of clay on a table that we were carving out paths and things for annoying the cleaners and things like that. And Jess and I were talking, and Jess started making sort of snippets of music to kind of go in there. And then all of a sudden we just went, oh, that's the story. Oh, that's what happened here. But it really started, I think, from the place. And when we started looking at photographs of Bore, we started going and reading some of the history behind it. Suddenly that was it. And it just was really, really naturally became, this is the place, this is what happened here, this is how it feels. And then everything else kind of coalesced around that.
Yeah, I think as an artist it made my job a lot easier, because those islands are so kind of like, the environment is kind of hostile. You're out there in the Hebrides. You've got this kind of like inclement weather. You've got cold, rain, snow. It's a very kind of it can be a very depressing place to be at times, but it's also
one of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther, but I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used or doesn't work at the time, because actually there'll come a place or in a time where you think, hang on a minute, I've got something that fits. So in terms of that memorable theme, the Remember theme gets used in multitude of different ways during the game. And
Stop talking.
White Lines.
yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bore and the Hebrides. If their disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it, because it feels really real, because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life, but that's really cool. Because I mean, my thing about the White Lines is that it was this completely surreal thing, but also it was kind of it just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that? and putting that into the game was kind of challenging, because to me it just seemed like, oh, it's going to be really hard to pull off in a way that's kind of realistic. But then when you look at the kind of art style of the game, it's not really a realistic thing. Like, everything is half imagined. So in that way, it kind of really fit into the landscape, and it kind of creates this amazing sort of landmark that you see in the environment. And I just found it really interesting to hear about that. Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where it's not a realistic place. And I mean, no game is a realistic place anyway, but one of those things where understanding that you're making something which isn't real, and you have that kind of capacity to be sort of, to explore it artistically. And we'll come back and talk about sort of like it not being realistic, I think, in a little while.
And we won't.
Something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing. In the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story. And something that was missing in the original mod version was just this lack of a visual layer of story. And something that I did throughout the art of the game is to add in all these little details here and there, little bits of story, little links to certain things that you may or may not hear or see, just a layer of richness in the world, and give you some kind of reward for exploring. So keep your eye out as you look around.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and that it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where, I think it's Chuck at that point as the vocalist before Mike Patton, just says, Dear Esther. And it really lodged with me, because the sound Dear Esther just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and the idea of it being these series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod, was can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result. It becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
Okay, so what I've taken so far from this game is basically these guys got together and made a game about nothing. And you just walk around and see nothing and fucking do nothing. And somehow, because I guess it's visually a nice game around 2007 or whatever, whenever this came out, people were like, oh my god, this game is amazing. But really, it's not anything. It's not. I wouldn't even call this a game, because you don't actually do anything. Every single button, all it does is make you zoom in. Like, you know, like I'm making my way over to this boat because I'm like, oh, maybe there's something in the boat or around the boat, or I can't even make it to the boat. I'm like, whatever, man. Game's awesome. Awesomely shitty. It's like the Room of video games. Now I'm drowning? What the fuck? I made it over here, now I can't make it back? Jeez. And I guess this is the song that the chick wrote that was the most amazing song ever written. It's just kind of annoying and loud. I don't have any feet. I'm floating. I can hear footsteps.
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic.
Yeah,
I
'cause you
wanted
had no
to
money.
leave room for the player to think and to dream
You had no
and
money.
to wonder
Thinking
and to put
to
their own
wonder. You have no
interpretation
money,
into
that's
what
why.
was happening.
And that's the only
And I
music
think the
you
problem
wrote.
with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and that it really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret, and that was one of their favourite things. They placed themselves so directly into the game, and it's their experience. And I think that's actually the greatest success of the game on all points, from the story to Rob's art to the music, is we all left space for the player to dream.
I love how they keep calling it a game, too. I love that. Because this isn't a game, there's nothing to fucking do. Like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be scared,
So
but it's not really scary.
Places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. But so it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting, where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
I'm stuck. Apparently I beat the first level. Woohoo! Points!
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're going through this space and actually it's completely devoid of people.
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting. It's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you were doing. For me, it was kind of interesting that you could play some of the best moments in Doom are the bits where nothing's happening and you're just doing it, or System Shock, or those games that I absolutely love. Those quiet moments were the really powerful ones. But Esther is definitely slower than a lot of games, and I think that's actually why it's lasted. I think if we did have moments where we went, should it be faster, should we put a sprint button in, but I'm so pleased that we kind of held our nerve and went,
Oh,
no, just
you
as like in real
motherfuckers.
life, I don't run everywhere because that would be weird. It's
Oh,
okay
you
to have a
fucking
game where you
assholes.
don't run everywhere, and actually it is
I
a bit
really
weird to
wish
run
they would have
everywhere.
put a fucking
But if you're gonna
sprint
do
button.
that, then you've got to support it in other ways, and I think the music was a really powerful way of supporting that change
Oh,
of pace.
fuck off.
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time round. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in. We had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character and the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, just came in and just got it. And one of the hardest things with the voiceover that we did was when we went from the mod, which had 3 potential narrative units per queue, to 4 potential narrative units per queue, was not only finding new bits of writing that kind of complemented and played off what was there in the original mod, but for Nigel to come back in, nearly 5 years later, and to just re-find that voice in exactly the same way and deliver it in a way that fitted in and complemented it was a real testament to his ability as an actor, I think. That apart from we had spent quite a lot of time trying to make the sound actually sound the same in terms of mic placement and things like that, but in terms of the actual delivery of those new monologues, you wouldn't know that was both written and acted sort of 4.5 years after the original thing was done. So the one person who's not in the room sort of today but deserves a huge amount of credit for how the game kind of eventually was delivered, but also I think in terms of how the game has lasted, a huge amount of respect needs to go to Nigel Carrington for his work on it.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game.
Yes.
In some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like,
Yeah.
we have no real death in the game, and from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you...
It was really hard because it was, you know, it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urges of the player.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or
Yeah.
there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience by dying and reloading, then you're in you start breaking the experience a lot. So
Yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, you know, where it's like an invisible wall. If you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to, but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of, the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole, we have to start from that basis, they will throw themselves down this hole, it kind of gave us the impetus to really, really focus on it. And I think the stuff like the drowning deaths and the cliff deaths are strong because the hole was there, and I'm not sure if the hole hadn't been there, whether or not we'd have arrived at those that way.
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But
it's a horse
the
barn.
island is also a beautiful and magnificent
you can
place.
see the
and what I
different,
wanted to do at this
like you
point
put a
for
horse
the first
there,
time in the
horse
game
here, horse
is to
here,
create
horse here.
something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style, actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write, actually, because it has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually, just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic, as Jesse said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky, there's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there. And I think it's just like all of these elements coming together and just in perfect synergy, and just kind of, it really brings chills up your spine.
So I guess the voiceover, we don't have it turned on because we're listening to the director's commentary. I don't know what the hell the guy's saying.
So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game's absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again, the whole sequence in Dead Space 2. Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table. And I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from it the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting
Shut up.
because when we made it, we kind of had to.
I wanted to know what he was talking about
there was
the
no intention really. We kind of wanted this
ultrasound and
dreamy.
the asshole.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from it the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not just about her, there is an unborn child here. And I think that's where the randomisation just hits its absolute peak, because it's one tiny detail that may or may not be there, but if it's there, it's going to fundamentally change the way you feel about the entire.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever going to kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few tests at the beginning, and when I realized this wasn't possible, I kind of went back and I kind of did some research on different styles, and one of the ones that really struck me was this kind of impressionistic painterly.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here, but when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker. And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, to me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real, like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of, it's not obvious, it's not in your face, it's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know. And
one of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.
I can't move. Whoa. Who's lighting the fucking candles? See, this is the... Who the fuck is here?
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you used to before this point. It's you know, we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal
Okay, who's
music
lighting the
cue
candles?
in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it. And it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves and games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is, I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just, it's a real high watermark. I kind of, it's one of the areas in all of the games we've made that I'm most proud of.
I think as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear
Yes.
Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something completely unexpected and completely new, and I think it just throws the player such a curveball in such a wonderful way.
So the glowing that is happening in the caves is actually a real thing. It's I can't remember what it's called. It's like live algae or something that actually grows. I don't know if there's growing mushrooms in real life, but it definitely is glowing caves. I know that in the States there's one somewhere, and I don't know if they glow that intensely, but
I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head. and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and that Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's really important
who's
to me
lighting
is
the
that
candles?
Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that the real kind of hardcore of the hardcore in terms of these are first-person shooter modders have gone, this is really good and really special and we're behind this, then you've already got the support of a really amazing gaming community. And
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all
Fucking cave
times
is
in
huge.
terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you know at this point in the game is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication or the attempt or failing communication or trying to speak through the comb or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution, and there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games.
I never saw a boat go past, but somebody's here, man. They keep saying nobody's here, nobody's here. There's candles lit. They say a fucking paper boat went past. Oh wait, we didn't go that way, did we? Those can actually happen in real life too.
in a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there.
Well,
I think because of the strength of the music.
Yeah, I forgot.
And this
The
goes right back to
voiceover's not
original
working
mod.
because we got
wanted
the
that to
director's
be the voice and
commentary.
for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then it was, you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely, and rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, it was able to, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge, because suddenly I was having to write like a poet, of going, every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect, or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the...
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult, and yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
They made it so if you fall in here, you can't get out. And apparently I don't drown. So that's good. It came from there. More candles, yeah.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave, right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of... it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on, and it really, it's quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person is trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of just, it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and
This is a bit more pretentious one, because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio, and I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension for water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound, and I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it that breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but you're having to go back under again, and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious, and that struggle.
Why the fuck am I under the water?
Motorway scene. The biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from to have this scene, whether I just sort of went off or we discussed it, or I can't remember.
I can't remember. Can you remember? It just kind of appeared, didn't it? And then
it was just this kind of. I think for me, actually, I remember being some technical difficulty between the drop and then coming out at the end part. But it was the same thing that we dealt with in the past of, like, how do we not kill the player? From a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that. But it was also, I can't remember where the whole thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game, actually. I think it's just it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful. And from an audio point of view, you have that baby's heartbeat bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther...
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But we also know players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again, it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, you're kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, a car accident just outside a little chef, and that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm thinking I'm supposed to go this way. No. Guess not. It's not letting me go this way. Oh, wait. Something's going on. Well, I don't know if anything actually goes on in this game, but... What's the most noise or music that's been in the game?
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like, I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this, and the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Well, I'm coming out that
She
butthole.
sings always,
Squeezing
throughout,
out that cave's
always,
butthole
and
right
then
now.
She sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like
Cave butthole.
a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
it's
think
rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you literally move.
I have no idea what's happened, but get me out this cave butthole.
As you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like, that kind of just totally made it.
Let me out this cave butthole right now. More candles. Who's lighting the fucking candles?
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has Morse code, and the Morse code is spelling out the word Esther. And I really, really liked this concept of that some people would understand that it was Morse code and try and figure out what it was saying. It also provided a really interesting rhythmical dynamic. And yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasise the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm that just repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's a new chapter, and it's spelling out that something has changed at this point.
It's probably the level which has changed most from the original mod. I think it's much bigger than the final level in the mod. One of the major changes in there is in the original mod, the whole side of the cliff face was covered in painting and writing, and a lot of that moved inside to that corridor in the caves where it's really obsessionally painted on. And it was really, we spent so long on that because we were trying to get it looking right, because it's one of those really interesting examples where I love the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting, when it went into the rebuild, it just never worked. And I think it was because the environment was so crude in the mod that those symbols in that painting became the focus of the level, and it changed the feeling of the level completely, when actually that just wasn't something we could realise in any way, that not even technically, but just didn't artistically look and feel right. And I think probably sort of retrospectively looking back on it, that's about the sort of the sophistication and the subtlety that then came into the art, rather than just being, this is literally just a canvas that we write words on, to actually the environment telling its own story without the story being literally painted on it.
Yeah, it was very difficult when we were experimenting.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player, but actually going through this together, post having made it, we're still surprising each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it shows that we left interpretation for each other and that we trusted each other actually just to get on with it. And because we each brought our own special and unique contribution to the game, we didn't have to, in a way, talk it to death or say you have to justify every idea you have or talk it to death or explain it. That Rob's idea that the island is very tainted and corrupt, and my idea that Dan didn't know that the whole level of the caves is a birth metaphor. I think it's really amazing that we're still finding out things about the game that we didn't know.
I think it was nice when I came onto it, because Dan was basically
Who's lighting
like,
the fucking candles?
he gave me a bunch of materials, but he left me to my own devices.
I still don't know that.
We kind of like, I finished the level and Dan would play it and give me some feedback, but he was very kind of like hands off at the beginning, which was really nice, kind of. So a lot of my interpretations just came through that downtime where I was just kind of like going off and doing my own thing. And so yeah, it's like interesting to hear Dan talk about it sometimes.
Oh.
I've been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints.
What the fuck? Someone's up there, look.
They're to markate where an accident has taken place, so you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers.
Don't jump, you motherfucker. I haven't seen anybody for like hours.
Touched me. And so I said to Rob, I think it would be amazing to get these into the game somehow, and then Rob...
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again.
I'm coming.
And
very slowly, I can't run.
One of the things I read on the forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of story in there. So we added in a couple of cues within the fourth level that intimated much more strongly that actually Paul wasn't this other character who caused the accident, but actually you were responsible for everything. But again, it was then trying to find that balance of not overcooking it, so you weren't led to that idea, but just if you happen to have the combination of just a couple of narrative units, then you would possibly come to that interpretation. But it was really amazing to be able to say, it felt like giving something back to the fans that had enabled us to make the remake in the first place, and it's always a lovely moment as a developer to be able to recognise your fan community and kind of say, thanks, this one's yours, this one's here for you.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the three games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people, and I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong, powerful way of making it very accessible, the narrator's kind of inner turmoil, in a kind of a story that we know really well. And there's a universality. Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really. I think, like, my interpretation is kind of like, I always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through for God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and you know, all these events surrounding his story. But for me, I always feel like a little bit hopeful at the end. You know, the conclusion is just feels like a relief, and like this is kind of all ended in some way. What do you think, Jess?
I think it's a game about acceptance, and I really like that. And I think it's telling that a lot of people with mental health issues have responded really positively to the game, and we get a lot of emails and letters from those people saying that it's helped them through a really difficult time. And for me, that's because it's about the struggle of being human, that it's hard and that we love and that we grieve and we lose, but we come through it, and those things.
So, Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
You know what, I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing, but you know, I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative industry, and I think
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because
this game was
so
probably one of
simple,
the
everything is
easiest games to
exposed,
make.
and
Oh, we're
everything
going
has
to put a
be
candle.
exceptionally good for it to work.
Wow.
Because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face, and these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world.
The overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player, that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think we did. I think it really came together here, that you've got that sense of going, right, now this ends, and now I move forwards to it.
So here it kind of, the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colours a little bit, bring up the saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colours and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious, and some of that
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, yeah, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, this is wrong, actually, for what we're playing. And they said, let's strip out all the vibrato, let's play it in a really Scottish, plain style. And it absolutely transformed that piece, and it's one of the really special things about being a composer, is that you get to collaborate with people who come fresh
know
to
what
it,
the
so
fuck
you
they're
have this
doing.
preconceived idea of how it should be, and then they say,
These people who made
"No,
this
why
game
don't
had
we
no
turn it
idea
around
what
and
the
think
fuck they were
about it
doing.
like this?"
The chick
And it
doesn't know anything
absolutely
about.
fits and
She
works
basically
for
went
that
to
scene,
college
because what
to
we're
be
getting
like
at this
a
point
composer,
is a
like
sense of
worked with music, but
fragility.
she didn't really know anything about music.
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right. Quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end, and that this is it. And that unlike where
no,
the
I
rest of
didn't.
the island, there's this sense
Actually,
of this
buddy,
could just keep and
you
keep
fucking
going on
ass.
forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep the motif of come back, come back. But I think when you set on this path, we really wanted to have that sense of this is it, this is the last time you're going to walk these paths, this will end now. And that,
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that
Oh,
went
look, a
into kind of
candle. Look, that
building
was a
up
lot of work.
this,
We need to
feeling
put
of
something.
tension
We need to make
as
some
you're
tension.
rising and kind of
A candle.
making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into.
I see like a rail. Tension.
Building up this weather, building up the winds, and the swaying of the grass, and kind of the volume of the soundscapes, and everything mixing together with the music, and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a balance between two evils: the evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
Yeah, I agree. I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there. So, and the other thing for me was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump-off point, and just letting the players kind of noodle around going up a ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes because it's a tall tower was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring.
You'd never make
But
it to the
Dan's
water.
words are always
You'd
so
never make it.
amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover, it's the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so you would have failed if it wasn't good. But it is just so beautiful and moving.
And
for
my
me,
bird.
talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point, and it signifies to me transformation, freedom, escape, acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful cue to write, actually.
I don't know, I can't remember quite where it came from in the mod, but the moment when we went, or we could put the bird in there, and you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide into a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like, I always really believed the narrator did turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken. And I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view, so you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like I say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It kind of it's very like say it's kind of like a release, but at the same time there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for an ending of, it goes into the hospital monitor, signifying the flat line. And I think it's one of those moments where you never want to be so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows in through the music, and it just feels like everything comes together at that last point. That last VO, Rob's amazing visuals and the music. Yeah, it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last second, Nigel Carrington's delivery of just those two words have come back, where he just pitch perfect.
So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game, and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Yeah, we're not sitting here watching the people that made the game with no music. I can tell you that. I can tell you that right now.